I've been driving trucks for a long time, crossing state lines and navigating more highways than I can count. The first, he's seen a lot of things out there, mostly at night when the roads are quiet and the world feels like it's slipping into another realm. Particularly in the plains, there's something about the vastness that feels different. The emptiness, the sky stretching out forever, and the way the wind seems to carry whispers. It's hard to explain, but it's a unique place. I've encountered people out there, two strange figures just standing in the fields, looking lost or maybe just watching. Sometimes I swear I've seen things moving in the shadows, things that shouldn't be moving. Once, I even saw a line of people crawling on their hands and knees along the road, a whole procession stretching for what felt like miles. That was odd, but none of it compares to what happened one morning near the border, a morning that changed everything for me. This happened around 2010, while I was running a route along the northern border, hugging Canada for about 100 miles. This stretch wasn't exactly peaceful. Illegal activity was rampant, and any driver making this route knew the risks. You didn't go in blind. Most of us used our radios to keep each other posted on what was happening ahead, sometimes even mile by mile, sharing warnings if things got heated or if anything unusual came up. It was like a little network of survival. Usually it was quiet, just static, long stretches of nothing. But there were times when drivers spotted suspicious activity. A couple of trucks with their lights off following too closely, cars speeding without headlights, or even the occasional shootout that you'd hear about secondhand. But on that particular night, everything had been still. I wasn't even listening to the radio. I'd made this drive so many times that I had stopped thinking about it. It was just another route on another night. I had my usual pullouts that I like to use, spots off the radar, where I could rest without drawing too much attention. Not exactly legal parking, but when you're dealing with potential troublemakers, you want to be invisible. One spot I favored was off a dirt road down a wash between a couple of old billboards and into a gully where my truck could fit, just right, completely hidden from the highway. It was in Montana, in the middle of nowhere, the stars bright overhead, a perfect place to grab some sleep. I pulled in and shut down my engine, ate a quick dinner from my cooler. The air was still. The night was quiet except for an occasional breeze rustling through the fields. I watched the stars for a bit, let my mind drift, then climbed into my bunk and settled down for the night. I must have fallen asleep while watching a movie, because the next thing I remember was being jolted awake by a loud thud. Something had hit my truck hard. I sat up, blinking in the darkness, and just listened. There were footsteps outside. I moved to the front seat and peered out through the windshield. It was dark, too dark to see anything but vague shapes outside. Then the footsteps stopped, and I sat there holding my breath, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The night went quiet again. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, and climbed back into my bunk. Just as I was about to drift off again, I heard it, a scream. It sounded like it came from deep in the fields, really far off. It was long and drawn out, like someone was in real trouble. Then I heard another scream and another. It seemed like they were getting closer each time, as if whoever or whatever was out there was slowly moving toward me. I sat up again, heart pounding as I listened. After those screams came voices, too many to count, all overlapping, as they talked over one another. I couldn't make out any words. They were far away, distorted by distance, or just by the sheer emptiness of that place. But their tone sounded desperate, begging even. Then suddenly it all stopped, and somehow that silence afterwards felt worse, as if the land had swallowed everything up. For reasons unknown to me, I reached up and flipped on my high beams, flashing them 3 times into the night, maybe thinking it would help whoever was out there find their way, or maybe it was just instinct. The lights cut through darkness but revealed nothing, just empty fields stretching out before me. I reached for my radio, heart still racing, and called out to anybody nearby. After a few seconds of static, a voice crackled back, "Yeah, I hear you." "You see anything out there?" he asked. "No," I replied, "but I heard something screaming people. It sounds like they're in trouble." The other driver fell silent for a moment before responding in a low voice. "You want to stay put, friend? Just got shot at by someone driving without headlights, barely made it out myself," he continued cautiously. "There are cars racing up and down like they're looking for something or someone. Stay hidden. Whatever you heard isn't good." That definitely wasn't what I wanted to hear. "Thanks for the heads up," I said, but already felt that gnawing dread deep in my gut. After signing off, I sat there listening, but soon realized that night had gone dead quiet again. Eventually, I climbed back into my bunk, but sleep did not come easy. My mind kept replaying those screams, the voices, the eerie silence that followed them. Something wasn't right out there, and I didn't want to be around when it found me. Morning came early, and without hesitation, I got ready to leave. I wanted to be on the road, and far away from that spot as quickly as possible. My usual pre-drive checks went smoothly. I ran through them automatically. But when stepping out of the cab, what greeted me stopped me cold. About 20 feet from my truck lay a puddle of dark blood soaking into the ground, a big one, the kind that told you something bad had happened here. My first thought went immediately to an animal, a deer, or some other poor creature caught in a fight during the night, but then those screams echoed back in my mind. Walking over to inspect closer, I crouched down for a better look. There were no tracks around it, no signs of any animals, just blood. Straightening up with cold sweat prickling at my skin, I did a quick sweep of my truck. Everything seemed fine, no damage or anything missing. So I climbed back into my cab and started up my engine, backing out onto that dirt road, and then saw clothes scattered everywhere. At first glance, they didn't register as anything significant, just scraps of fabric, lying in dust, as if someone had tossed them from a vehicle. But as I drove further along, I started seeing more shirts, pants, shoes all scattered along that road, and then more blood, a few more pools, streaking across ground, splattered on rocks and bushes. And then I saw something horrifying. Body parts, or at least what remained of them, hands, feet, pieces of torso, all mixed with clothing, like someone had torn these people apart and discarded them like trash. That's when the smell hit me, a thick, sickening mix of blood. Neuron, I slammed on brakes with heart pounding and hands shaking on wheel, not wanting to keep going, not wanting to see more, but had no choice. I needed to get away from there. Grabbing my radio, I called out for help, with voice cracking, barely steady enough to speak. A few other drivers responded, quickly, all sounding just as spooked as me. "There's something going on out here," one said gravely. "A lot of people got hurt last night. It's all over news, they're calling it the Mother's Day Massacre." My stomach churned. I'd heard stories about such acts before, but this felt worse than anything else, a nightmare come alive. I put my truck back in gear, drove not looking back, not wanting to see any more horrors behind me. But those images stayed burned into memory, the blood, the bodies, the screams echoing through night. Then something else struck me. It wasn't just bodies or blood, it was silence. For a moment I'd seen those remains. Not once did I hear birds chirping, insects buzzing, not even wind brushing through grass. The land felt deathly still, as if everything held its breath, watching, waiting. The radio crackled again. A voice unfamiliar called, "This is Jawbreaker. You still out there? Did you see him?" I didn't answer. I've been a delivery driver for most of my life, and while long trips keep the bills paid, I don't mind taking the occasional short run if the price is right. These jobs aren't glamorous. In fact, they can be quite dull. However, there's something satisfying about hitting the open road for a few hours and earning more than I would for an entire day's work. About 6 months ago, I stumbled upon one of these quick jobs in a small town I barely knew anything about. The pay was unusually high for such a short haul, but I didn't ask too many questions. Drivers learn to keep their heads down and not to pry, especially when the money is good. The first few jobs were straightforward, delivering raw materials like steel beams, concrete blocks, and gravel. I transported these from one end of the valley to the other. Eerie itself wasn't much to look at, just rolling hills with dry grass and a few scattered farms with a lot of empty space in between. The towns were small, just communities of a few thousand people here and there, so I didn't spend much time there. I would show up, grab the trailer, then drop it off at a lot in Maplewood, easy money with no hassle. Over time, I got used to this work and learned the routes well, even while doing my regular long hauls on the side. These short trips were just a way to keep things steady when bigger jobs weren't coming in. One morning, I received a request that was different from the usual ones. The email came through like always brief and to the point, but this time the instructions felt off. The pickup location wasn't your typical warehouse. It was remote and unorthodox. They said the whole haul would be off the grid, no paved roads except for getting out of town. That should have been my first warning sign. No name was attached to this job, just coordinates for where I'd find the trailer. Normally, I would pass on something that's sketchy, but the payout was too tempting to ignore. It probably belonged to some wealthy local farmer who didn't want to deal with red tape. I've encountered those types before, big money with little patience and an attitude that makes them think they're above rules and regulations. I started imagining what could be inside that trailer: cash, illegal goods, or something even worse. The next day, I loaded up my truck and headed out following those vague instructions as dawn broke. There's a peaceful feeling when you're on an open road, the engine humming, as you cut through the morning mist. The directions led me out of town and down a county highway before instructing me to pull off into a dusty turnout. Sure enough, there was a trailer sitting there, no lock, no guard, not even a chain to prevent someone from taking it away. I inspected it briefly. It looked clean and well maintained, but that only added to my unease. It felt wrong, somehow intact yet neglected at the same time. There were no markings on it either, which was odd. As I drove out onto the highway, something nagged at me. All the farms were on one side of town, not on this side where I was headed. It didn't make sense why I would be hauling something away from farmland. I scratched my head as possibilities ran through my mind. Maybe it was some kind of black market deal, or stolen property, or perhaps I was just overthinking it all. Either way, I couldn't shake that feeling of something being off. The directions took me straight through town, past old brick buildings and tired storefronts that seemed frozen in time. People were milling about, walking their dogs or grabbing coffee, completely unaware that I might be transporting something illegal right through their quiet community. Then it hit me. What if I was carrying toxic waste, or something even more dangerous? On the other side of town, I picked up an old mining road just like the instructions said. The further I drove, the more uneasy I felt. The road narrowed as it wound through dense trees and rocky hills, a place where you start questioning if you're really going in the right direction. I hadn't seen another vehicle since leaving town, and without cell service out here, if something went wrong, I'd be completely alone. No one to call for help, just me in this trailer full of who knows what. The instructions mentioned looking for a pullout marked with orange cones. After several miles, I finally spotted them. The pullout was wide enough for me to unload without any trouble, and there wasn't another soul around, no buildings or cars, just trees and dirt, as far as I could see. As I parked and got out to unhook the trailer, I noticed it was unlocked, no padlock or seal, which was unusual since most loads are secured tightly. Curiosity got the better of me. Surely if I was hauling something questionable, I'd have a right to know what it was. So I swung open the doors and immediately regretted it. The stench hit me like a punch in the gut, some kind of rotting meat that made me gag as I covered my mouth with my sleeve. Inside was packed full of meat, raw cuts of beef and pork, stacked haphazardly on metal racks, not in a refrigerated trailer, either, all spoiling and oozing blood onto the floor in thick puddles. My stomach turned as I slammed the door shut. What on earth was this? The smell lingered as I unhooked the trailer and climbed back into my cab. For a moment my hand shook on the steering wheel as confusion washed over me. Why would anyone transport meat like this knowing it would spoil. And why here in the middle of nowhere where nobody could pick it up? I drove back trying to push it all out of my mind. By the time I returned to town, I'd convinced myself it wasn't my problem anymore. I had done my job and would get paid for it. That night in bed, though, thoughts swirled around the smell, the meat, the strange instructions. It felt like there was something crucial missing from this puzzle. The next day, when I checked my bank account, sure enough, the payment had gone through, but not from any local farmer's account. No, it came from a government account. That's when real unease set in. Why would they pay me for hauling rotting meat? What were they doing with that trailer out here? My curiosity got the better of me. I had to know what happened next. I grabbed my truck again, a trusty Chevy, and drove back to where I'd left that trailer. The cones were still there, but no trailer in sight. As I walked around searching for clues, deep tire tracks caught my eye leading away from where I'd parked back into the woods. Someone had come for that trailer, but they hadn't come from town. They'd come from deeper within those woods. Following those tracks led me straight to an old abandoned mine entrance. The tracks disappeared into darkness, where no truck should ever go. My heart raced as possibilities flooded my mind. Whatever was happening here wasn't something I wanted any part of anymore. Without looking back once, I turned around and drove away. That was my last short haul in that valley. To this day, I'm left wondering what exactly I transported that morning, or more importantly, why. In the early 2000s, life felt different. You could venture anywhere without a trace, and no one would know where you had been or what you had done. People often hitchhiked across the country, backpacking through bustling cities, quiet towns, deserts, and forests. There was a sense of freedom back then that seems lost today. We didn't have smartphones or GPS tracking our every move. You could vanish for days, or even months without anyone noticing. That was both thrilling and frightening. I spent most of my time during those years traveling. People called me a free spirit, but I never thought of myself that way. I was just a guy who didn't want to feel trapped. Honestly, I was running away from my fears, from the overwhelming presence of technology, and from responsibilities. Whatever it was, I was always on the move. One trip stands out in my memory, a journey I've tried to forget. It took place in the vast deserts of Arizona. It started innocently enough. I had been hitchhiking for a couple of days. I managed to catch rides here and there, but my supplies were dwindling. No food or water, just the clothes on my back and a backpack filled with random items. That morning I got lucky when a couple picked me up. At first they seemed friendly, but as we drove on, the atmosphere shifted. Maybe it was something I said, or perhaps the heat was getting to them. They grew quiet and exchanged uneasy glances. By noon they pulled over and let me out without a word. Suddenly I found myself alone in the middle of the Arizona desert. No shade, no shelter, just endless stretches of dry land under the blazing sun. I felt lightheaded from the heat. My mouth was parched like sandpaper, knowing I wouldn't last long without water or shelter. I started walking, because there was no other option. Each step felt heavier than the last as I kicked up dust clouds behind me. Occasionally I glanced at the horizon hoping to see something, anything, but all that greeted me were heat waves and emptiness. Then I spotted a small dot in the distance, a truck speeding across the desert. It was still miles away, but unmistakably real. I turned around and waved my arms frantically to catch the driver's attention as it approached. The truck's engine roared, shaking the ground beneath me as it honked loudly when it reached me. The driver stepped out, a tall man with broad shoulders and a scruffy beard, wearing a cap pulled low over his eyes. He took a drag from his cigarette as he sized me up. "You look like you've seen better days," he said with a gravelly voice. "Need a ride?" I nodded, too exhausted to speak, as he motioned for me to get in. The moment I sank into the passenger seat and felt the cool air from the AC hit my face, it felt heavenly. "I'm Jake," he said casually as he shifted gears and we rolled on down the road. You hitchhiking through this heat, or just looking for trouble? I managed a weak laugh while wiping sweat from my brow. A bit of both. I got stranded out here. It's no problem, Jake replied nonchalantly. I've been driving these roads long enough to know when someone's in trouble. We chatted for a while as we drove on. He told me about places he'd been and strange things he'd seen while I shared some stories of my own. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with me. My eyelids grew heavy. You look beat, Jake observed. Why didn't you take a nap? This heat can wear you out fast. I hesitated but soon succumbed to sleep with gratitude for his offer. When I awoke, darkness surrounded us. The sun had set and stars dotted the sky. The truck still rumbled along smoothly, but something felt off. As I blinked away sleepiness, panic surged through me. I couldn't move. Glancing down revealed thick ropes binding me to my seat. Don't struggle, Jake said ominously from the shadows beside me. My heart raced as fear gripped me tighter than any rope could. What is happening? He chuckled darkly. You've met Charlie. My eyes widened as I realized what he meant. A massive snake coiled around me like an unyielding seatbelt. Relax, Jake continued with an unsettling grin. Charlie won't hurt you unless you give him a reason. I fought against rising panic but forced myself to remain still as Jake explained that Charlie had originally been brought on board to keep pests away, but had grown too large for that purpose. You ever been scared? He asked suddenly with an eerie excitement in his voice. Like really scared. It's exhilarating. I stared at him in disbelief as he continued talking about how much he enjoyed pushing people's limits before they broke. Play nice, he warned with a grin that sent shivers down my spine. And I'll let you go, but first we need to feed Charlie. Jake opened the glove compartment, revealing a plastic bag containing what looked like a dead rat, its body limp and stained with dried blood. Feed him, Jake commanded menacingly. My stomach churned at the thought. Tears stung my eyes as I leaned forward reluctantly and bit into that rat's fur. The taste of decay filled my mouth like nothing I'd ever experienced before. Charlie stirred slightly at the smell. I held out what remained of the rat in front of me, praying for mercy, while Jake watched with twisted amusement. After what felt like an eternity of waiting in horror, Charlie finally moved forward and snatched the rat from my grasp in one swift motion. Seizing my chance, I yanked myself free from my bindings and flung open the door, just as Jake slammed on brakes, cursing loudly at my sudden escape. I tumbled onto the asphalt, but didn't stop. I jumped up and ran into the night, as fast as I could while hearing Jake's manic laughter echo behind me. Run, boy, run. For hours I wandered through darkness, trying to shake off what had just happened. The taste still lingering in my mouth, along with memories of Jake's chilling laughter. Eventually, spotting city lights in the distance felt like salvation after such terror. However, fear kept me cautious even when another truck passed by on its way out of sight. After that nightmarish experience, hitchhiking became something I avoided entirely. I learned my lesson well. Never trust strangers on lonely roads again. I always believed that love was enough. You know, the type of love that shines brightly enough to make even tough days feel like nothing more than a small headache. I thought that's what Jake and I had. He was my high school sweetheart after all. He could be as sweet as sugar when he wanted to be. But that's the thing about people, they can surprise you and change in ways you don't expect, especially when you're young and think you have everything figured out. We grew up in a small town in Oregon, where the summer heat clung to your skin like honey, and the horizon seemed endless. There wasn't much to do besides hang out at a local diner or work for the few businesses in town. Jake worked at a construction site, moving materials around, while I served tables at a cafe and sometimes helped out at the local library when they needed extra hands. It wasn't glamorous, but it was our life simple, so I thought. That was back in the early 2000s, when everything felt static, no smartphones tracking every moment, no social media sharing our lives with everyone. It was just us, the sky, and an open road if we wanted it to be. Jake and I were caught in our routine, but things began to shift when he started taking those energy pills from the gas station. Back then, they were popular among workers, basically legal speed. Jake joked about how they kept him awake and alert, allowing him to finish more work in less time. But I noticed changes happening even before he did. He started coming home later and later, his eyes always looking glazed over like he was lost in another world. His easygoing nature disappeared, replaced by a frantic energy that made him fidgety and irritable. It was always go, go, go with him, and it wore on me in ways I didn't understand at first. That's when his mood swings began. His patience vanished, replaced by a short temper that could ignite over the smallest things. If I dropped a plate, he would explode about how careless I was. If I asked him how his day went, he would rant about how nobody understood what it was like to work long hours alone. I started to wonder if maybe it wasn't worth it anymore, if the Jake I fell in love with had disappeared, replaced by someone unrecognizable. One night, after yet another argument over something trivial, I told him I was done. I couldn't live like this anymore, watching him fall apart more each day. He didn't respond, just stared at me with hollow eyes before storming out and slamming the door so hard that it rattled the walls. I watched him drive away in his truck, like he was fleeing from something. It felt like a sign. So I took my chance to pack up my things into boxes in a duffel bag. I wasn't going to stick around to December for another episode of his mood swings. This time I was leaving for good. Just as I was loading the last box into my car's trunk, I heard the rumble of his truck coming back down the road. My heart raced as he pulled up behind me, blocking my way out of the driveway. He jumped out and rushed toward me with rage in his voice. "What do you think you're doing?" he shouted, his breath reeking of alcohol. Before I could respond, he grabbed me and slammed me against my car hard enough that I gasped for air. I fought back, kicking and thrashing, but he was too strong. His grip felt like iron as he tied my wrists behind my back. I screamed for help, but we lived far enough away that only silence answered me. "You're not going anywhere," he growled as he dragged me toward his truck. In an instant, everything escalated. One moment I was leaving, and the next I found myself thrown into the back of his truck, like some kind of cargo. He locked me inside as darkness surrounded me. All I could hear was my own breathing mixed with the engine roaring to life. The ride felt endless as he swerved onto the main road. Every bump sent me crashing against metal walls inside the trailer. At some point during the chaotic journey, pain shot through my head. As it connected with something hard, I went limp after that. When we finally stopped moving and the engine went quiet, I held my breath as footsteps approached from outside. The door swung open. There he stood against the moonlight, a shadow of anger. "You think you can just leave?" he spat venomously. I tried to speak but couldn't find my voice. My throat felt dry and scratchy. Before I could gather myself, he yanked me up again and dragged me toward the open door of the truck. "One out," he sneered before shoving me hard onto the ground. I hit the dirt with a thud that knocked my breath away again. Everything blurred as I gasped for air, while trying to comprehend what was happening around me. He loomed over me like a storm cloud ready to unleash chaos. "I should leave you here," he said coldly. I tried crawling away, but felt his hand grab my ankle and pull me back toward him, just before everything went dark again, as he struck me in the back of my head. When consciousness returned hours later, faint voices echoed around me as blurry figures came into view. "Are you okay?" one asked gently. I nodded because speaking felt impossible at that moment. They noticed my zip-tied wrists and bruises without needing an explanation. They helped free me and offered a ride back to town. I didn't say much during that drive. I just stared out at passing scenery, feeling numb inside. until we arrived back in town. My car sat there with its trunk open and belongings scattered across the driveway. Jake's truck was nowhere in sight. After packing up what remained of my life with my sister's help, everyone in town knew what had happened, so it wasn't hard to keep Jake away from me anymore. Not that he stayed around much after that anyway. We worked nonstop like nobody else could keep up with him. Years later, news reached me that Jake died in an accident on one of those lonely roads, and you know what? Not a single tear fell from my eyes and my mind. It felt like justice served without needing any laws involved. Sometimes monsters take care of themselves. I've always enjoyed the solitude of being on the road. Some people find the endless stretches of highway and empty landscapes unsettling. But for me, it's calming. It's just you, your truck, and the open road. You can lose yourself in your thoughts without any distractions. That night, I was driving through the middle of Wyoming on a desolate highway, with no signs of life in sight. It was nearly midnight when I began to notice something was off with my truck. The engine emitted a faint sputtering noise, barely noticeable at first, but enough to catch my attention. I glanced at the dashboard. Everything appeared normal, no warning lights or signs of trouble. However, the sputtering persisted, a quiet cough from the engine, as if it were struggling. I had another 2 hours to reach the next rest stop, and I thought I could make it there before anything serious happened. About 20 minutes later, the sputtering escalated into a full-on stutter, and suddenly the engine died. The truck coasted to a slow stop on the side of the road, leaving me in the heavy silence of the night. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly. I had taken good care of my truck. It had never let me down before. I turned the key again, hoping it was just a fluke, but all I got was that awful clicking sound of a dead engine. Frustrated, I turned on my hazard lights and stepped out of the cab. The night air hit me like a wall of heat, despite it being well past sundown. Something felt off about it. I popped open the hood and grabbed my flashlight from the toolbox, shining it over the engine. I'm no mechanic, but I know enough to check for basic issues. Everything looked fine, no leaks or visible damage, but something was definitely wrong. No matter how many times I tried to start the truck, it wouldn't budge. I picked up my CB radio, Breaker 19. Anyone out there? I'm stuck on the side of the highway, my rig's dead. My voice echoed through the cab, but all I received in return was static. I tried again, louder this time, feeling more anxious by the second. Come on, someone's got to be out there, but still nothing, just static. I stood there for a moment as silence pressed in around me. My phone had no signal, and walking to the nearest town felt impossible from where I was stuck in this vast emptiness. A chill crept up my spine. That unsettling feeling that something wasn't right lingered in the air. Just as I was about to climb back into my cab, I noticed headlights approaching in the distance, faint, but getting closer. Relief washed over me. Maybe it was another trucker who could help or at least give me a ride to safety. As the vehicle drew nearer, I saw it was an old beat-up pickup truck that came to a halt a few yards ahead of my rig. A man stepped out. He was tall and thin with dusty clothes that suggested he'd been traveling for days. Instinctively, something about him made me uneasy. Need some help? He asked in a gravelly voice. For a moment, I hesitated. His presence felt off. But what choice did I have? Stranded in this desolation left me no room for picky decisions. Yeah, I replied with forced cheerfulness. My truck broke down, not sure what happened. He nodded slowly while eyeing my rig. Mind if I take a look? He asked. I hesitated again, but ultimately agreed since he was my only option for help. He approached my truck with an unsettling calmness and peered under the hood without asking any questions about what might be wrong. The longer he stood there without moving much at all, just listening intently under the hood, the more my unease grew. See anything wrong? I asked, trying to break the silence. He didn't respond immediately. When he finally turned to face me, His expression was oddly amused as he said slowly, "Looks like you're in trouble." He continued with an unsettling calmness, "There's a place not far from here where we can tow your rig and get you fixed up." Every instinct screamed at me to refuse his offer. Something about his tone felt sinister rather than helpful. "I appreciate it," I said cautiously, "but I think I'll wait for a tow truck." His eyes narrowed slightly as we stood there, staring at each other under my truck's headlights. "You sure? It's a long way to town. Could be hours before anyone else comes through." My heart raced as anxiety surged within me. Something wasn't right here. "I'm sure," I replied firmly while forcing another smile. He stared at me for what felt like an eternity before turning back toward his pickup truck, but not leaving. He just sat there idling his engine while watching me intently from behind his windshield. I backed away toward my cab and locked all doors while trying to convince myself everything would be fine, that he would leave soon. But that uneasy feeling wouldn't subside. Minutes turned into an hour with him, still parked beside me. Suddenly, his truck lurched forward next to mine again. Dread twisted in my stomach as his silhouette loomed near my window, illuminated by his dashboard lights, as he leaned out and asked again, "You sure you don't want that help?" I remained silent as panic gripped me tighter than before, while reaching for my phone again, still no signal. And then he got out of his truck and walked towards mine with purpose. Desperately fumbling for my keys while trying to start my engine proved futile. It still wouldn't turn over as he approached closer and closer with that same deliberate pace that had set off alarms in my head from the start. I grabbed a tire iron from under my seat and held it tightly in trembling hands. If he tried to get inside, I have no choice but to defend myself. He reached my door and knocked hard. "Open up. Let's have a talk." I didn't move or breathe, just sat there clutching that tire iron while feeling trapped as fear coursed through me like electricity. Just then, headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, a distant engine approaching, and hope surged within me as another vehicle cut through darkness like a beacon. The man froze mid-knock as he glanced back at the approaching vehicle before turning swiftly away and heading back to his truck without another word. He slammed his door shut and sped off into the night just as relief washed over me. The other driver pulled up behind me, a fellow long-haul trucker passing through, and when I told him what had just happened, he offered to stay with me until help arrived. Time blurred until finally assistance came. That man never returned. After years on this job driving trucks across America's highways, that night remains etched in memory, closest I've ever come to real danger. Now, whenever I'm on those deserted roads again, I'm always cautious and keep an eye on everything around me, because sometimes those who offer help are not who they seem. For nearly 2 decades, I've been on the road as a long-haul truck driver. You get used to the solitude, the long hours, and the isolation that comes with it. I've driven through every kind of weather on roads that seem to stretch endlessly into towns, so small they barely existed on a map. But in all those years, there's only one particular night that still haunts me. I was making a cross-country haul from California to Florida. It was late October, and I had just crossed into Texas when I realized I needed to pull over for the night. I had been driving for nearly 11 hours straight, and my eyelids were getting heavy. You know that feeling when your brain starts to slow down, and before you know it, you're nodding off at the wheel. Not safe. Safe. I wasn't near any major truck stops, just a long, empty stretch of highway with nothing in sight. I figured I'd keep an eye out for the next rest area and pull over there for a few hours of sleep. It wasn't ideal, but I had done it plenty of times before. That's when I saw the sign, "Rest Area 2 miles." Perfect timing. As I approached the exit and pulled off the highway, I could already tell something was off. The place was practically deserted, only 2 other trucks in the lot, parked at the far end with their cabs dark and lifeless. The rest area itself wasn't much to look at. Just a few parking spaces, a couple of picnic tables, and an old restroom building. There were no lights except for a single flickering street lamp near the entrance, casting eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. I parked my rig in the middle of the lot, not too close to the other trucks, but not too far either. Something about the isolation felt unsettling, but I figured I was just being paranoid. I cut the engine and sat there for a moment, letting the silence of the night settle around me. It was unnervingly quiet, no wind, no crickets, no distant hum of traffic, just dead silence. I grabbed my thermos and took a long swig of coffee, hoping it would shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine, but it didn't help. After a few minutes, I decided to stretch my legs and use the restroom before settling in for some sleep. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the cab. The night air was cold, and the ground crunched under my boots as I walked toward the restroom building. The restroom was in worse shape than I expected. The door hung slightly off its hinges, and graffiti covered the walls. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The smell hit me first, musty and damp like it hadn't been cleaned in ages. I flicked on the light switch, but nothing happened. Pointing my flashlight at the cracked tiles and peeling paint, I tried to find the least disgusting stall to use. As I was doing my business, I heard the sound of footsteps, soft at first, then louder, like someone was walking slowly around the building. I froze. The rest area had been empty when I pulled in. No other cars had arrived since then, and those trucks parked at the far end were still dark and silent. So who was walking around? I quickly finished up and stepped out of the stall, straining to hear but realizing that the footsteps had stopped. Maybe it was just my imagination, or an animal, or something else. I opened the door and shined my flashlight around the lot. Nothing but eerie silence and dim light from that flickering street lamp in the distance. Taking a deep breath to calm my nerves, I made my way back to my truck. Halfway back to my rig, I saw him, a man standing by one of the picnic tables. He blended into the darkness with his hands stuffed into his pockets and his face hidden by a hood pulled over his head. My heart skipped a beat. He hadn't been there when I'd gotten out of my truck, I was sure of it. I kept my flashlight trained on him, but he didn't move. He just stood there completely still. Something about his posture made my skin crawl, as if he were waiting for something. Forcing myself to keep walking, so as not to show any fear, I got closer to my truck, but glanced over my shoulder. The man hadn't moved. He was still standing there watching me. Climbing into my cab, I locked the doors behind me and sat there for a moment with shaking hands, telling myself it was nothing, just another traveler, or maybe another trucker. But why hadn't I seen him pull in? Peeking out of the window again, he was gone. Trying to relax despite everything, I lay down on my bed in back of the cab, hoping to get some sleep, but found myself unable to shake off that uneasy feeling about him by the picnic table, the way he stood there, watching me in shadows. I don't know how long I lay there. It must have been close to an hour before drifting off, when suddenly I heard it again. Footsteps right outside my truck. Shooting up in alarm, I grabbed my flashlight and shined it through the window. But no one was there, just an empty parking lot, illuminated by that flickering street lamp against endless darkness. The footsteps continued circling around my truck. Now slowly and deliberately, my stomach twisted with fear. This wasn't just imagination, someone or something was out there. Listening carefully as they stopped right outside my door, I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. But then came a knock, soft at first, almost polite, like someone tapping gently on my door. I didn't move, I couldn't. Then came another knock, louder, this time more insistent. Leaning forward, trying to peer through without making it obvious, I couldn't see anyone, just shadows cast by that street lamp outside. Then from another side of cab, I heard it again, a knock like someone or maybe more than one person tapping on both sides at once. Grabbing my phone with trembling hands as I dialed 911, but no signal, cursing under my breath, knowing how remote this area was. Of course there would be no service here. The knocks continued more aggressive now. It felt like whoever was out there wasn't just messing with me, they wanted in, debating whether to get out or try scaring them off. But something told me that would be a bad idea. There were more than one person out there, I could feel it, and they were waiting for me. I don't know what made me do it, but suddenly I slammed my fist against horn, the loud blare echoing through empty rest stop. For a moment the knocking stopped, and holding breath, caught listening for any sign of movement. I heard it, a car engine headlights illuminating darkness as another vehicle pulled into lot. Its bright beams swept across pavement, revealing shadows lurking outside truck. 3 figures stood scattered around rig, all wearing dark clothes with faces hidden by hoods. When car lights hit them, they froze, then quickly scattered, disappearing into darkness. Not wasting time, I turned key, starting engine, peeling out of that rest stop as fast as possible. Heart racing, hands shaking, gripping wheel. I didn't look back, I didn't want to. Drove straight through night, not stopping, until hitting well-lit truck stop hours later. Even then didn't feel safe. Couldn't stop thinking about figures knocking on doors. I told fellow truckers what happened. One mentioned rumors about that rest stop. It wasn't first time something like this occurred. People had gone missing, trucks found abandoned, but never any proof, just stories. Now I never stop at remote rest areas anymore. You never know who or what might be waiting for you in dark. And worst part is one still hear those knocks sometimes. I've been a delivery driver for over 20 years, and let me tell you, I've seen some strange things out on the road. Long stretches of highway at night can play tricks on your mind. Sometimes you see shadows that aren't really there, where your tired eyes start to blur reality. You get used to the isolation and the endless miles of nothingness. But there was one night on a stretch of road that I'll never forget. It was a late November evening, and I was transporting goods through Arizona, heading down a remote highway that cut through miles of empty desert. The road was as straight as an arrow, with no towns for miles, no gas stations, no rest stops, just pitch black on either side of me. I usually don't mind the solitude, it gives me time to think and clear my head. But that night, something felt off. The air was heavy, like a weight sitting on my chest that made it hard to breathe. My headlights illuminated nothing but the cracked asphalt in front of me. I glanced at the clock on my dashboard. 11:47 p.m. I still had a few hours to go before I planned to pull over for the night, but I wasn't feeling tired. There was an uneasy energy in the air that kept me alert, like my body knew something was coming before my mind did. About an hour into my drive, I first noticed the car. At first, it was just a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror, or in the distance. I didn't think much of it. It's rare to see other vehicles out on roads like these at that time of night. Maybe it was another driver, or someone traveling cross-country. Still, I kept an eye on it, a habit I picked up over the years, since knowing what's behind you is just as important as watching what's in front. But the car didn't seem to be gaining on me. It stayed back, keeping the same distance. After about 20 minutes of this, I started to feel suspicious. I had been driving steadily at around 65 mph, and any car behind me should have caught up by now or at least gotten closer, but this one stayed exactly where it was. I tried to dismiss the discomfort growing in my stomach. Maybe it was just someone who didn't want to pass or was nervous about being out here alone. Still, I couldn't help glancing back at the mirror every few minutes, waiting for the car to either speed up or fall behind, but it didn't, just stayed there. Another 30 minutes passed without any change. My palms were starting to sweat, and I couldn't focus on the road ahead of me, only those headlights in my mirror. My heart began racing even though nothing had really happened yet. Something deep down told me this wasn't normal. I took a deep breath to steady myself. I'd been through worse, driven through blizzards, and nearly jackknifed on icy roads. But no matter how many times I tried to push the fear aside, it crept back in, my cold hand gripping my neck. I turned up the radio, hoping to drown out my thoughts, but only found static. Stations are few and far between out here. I switched it off and tried focusing on the road again, but that car remained in my mirror, an unwavering presence that never blinked. Enough was enough. I decided to slow down and let the car pass me. If this driver was just messing with me, I'd call them out. If not, maybe they'd finally get the hint and go around. I eased off the gas and watched in the mirror as I slowed down to 50 mph. Then 40 mph, the car stayed exactly where it was, not getting closer or falling behind. My heart raced now. This wasn't possible. I slowed down more until I crawled along at 30 mph, but still those headlights didn't move. They were glued to that spot in my mirror. What was going on? I pressed the brakes and brought my truck to a complete stop in the middle of the road, staring into the rearview mirror, waiting for the car to catch up. When I looked again, it was gone. The road behind me was empty, no headlights. No car, just darkness stretching out for miles. Leaning forward, squinting into the mirror, trying to see if maybe it had turned off or pulled over somewhere, I saw nothing. The car couldn't just disappear like that, not here on this straight road with no turnoffs or exits. I must have missed something I had to. So, I threw the truck into gear and started moving again, faster this time. My hands slick with sweat as I barely kept grip on the wheel. My mind raced with explanations. Maybe they turned off their lights, or maybe I imagined it all. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, a nagging feeling told me something was wrong. About 15 minutes later, those headlights reappeared in my mirror again. My stomach dropped. The car was back. Same distance and same exact spot in my rearview. It felt like nothing had happened at all. My hands trembled on the wheel as panic rose in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Stopping again wasn't an option, not with whatever was happening behind me, and speeding up didn't help either. I tried staying calm and focused on the road ahead, but every few seconds my eyes flicked back to that mirror, watching those headlights stalk me like some kind of predator. Thoughts of pulling over at a gas station crossed my mind, but there wasn't one for another 40 miles, and something told me stopping wouldn't help. Then suddenly the car started moving. Blinking in disbelief, I watched as it got closer, slowly at first, but then picking up speed. My heart slammed against my ribs as I watched it approach, not swerving or flashing its lights, just coming straight for me, steady and fast. I floored it, speeding down the highway at 70 and 80 mph. But no matter how fast I went, that car kept gaining on me. It felt like something out of a nightmare. The headlights filled my rearview so bright that I had to squint just to see the road ahead. Then suddenly it was right on top of me, so close I could almost see its shape in my mirrors. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't think, I just knew I had to get away. But just as quickly as it appeared, the car veered off into darkness, disappearing from my mirror. I didn't stop until reaching a small gas station, a decaying place that looked untouched since the 70s, but at that moment I didn't care. Pulling into the lot, I jumped out of my truck and ran inside, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. The attendant looked at me like I was crazy, but I didn't care. I just needed people around me to feel less alone. After pacing for a few minutes, I told him what happened. He shrugged and gave me a knowing look. "You're not the first driver to see something strange on this road," he said. "Happens more than you'd think. Some folks say there's a haunted car that follows drivers out here, but it never actually does anything, just scares you." I didn't know what to say. Haunted? That couldn't be right. But then again, I couldn't explain what happened either. I stayed at that gas station for an hour, long enough for my heart rate to settle and hands steady before forcing myself back into my truck and continuing onward. Since then, I've avoided that route. like it's cursed, because no matter how much I try convincing myself it was just imagination, a part of me knows whatever was out there. That night it wasn't normal. I'm not sticking around to find out what happens if it catches you. I like to think of myself as someone who values practicality. After working as a long-distance delivery driver for many years, I've faced many challenges: flat tires, bad weather, and long nights on empty highways. However, there was one night on a particular road that still haunts me. It was about 6 years ago when I was driving through the Cascade Mountains. I had been on the road for hours, making a late-night delivery from Oregon to California. The task was straightforward: pick up the load, drive through the mountains, and deliver by morning. I had done this route many times before and expected nothing unusual. But that night felt different. Earlier in the evening, a thick fog rolled in one that clung to the ground and made it seem like I was driving through a dream or a nightmare. My headlights barely cut through the mist. Visibility was terrible, and I could only see a few feet ahead of me. The winding road disappeared into the fog, as if it were leading me somewhere forbidden. Still, I pressed on. I had a delivery window to meet and wouldn't let a little fog slow me down. I tried to focus on the road, but an unsettling silence surrounded me. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It felt as if the fog swallowed everything around me, leaving me utterly isolated. Around 2 a.m., I first heard it a whisper, so soft it nearly blended with the sound of my truck's engine. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks. Long hours on the road can do that, but the whisper didn't fade away. I turned my head slightly to listen more closely. It was soft, like someone murmuring right behind me. I glanced into the back of my cab, but of course there was no one there. Shaking my head, I told myself I was just tired and needed a break. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just fatigue. It felt like something was inside the truck with me, lingering just behind my ears and slipping through the cracks of my sanity. I turned up the heat, hoping the warmth would wake me up a bit. The fog outside remained thick, and I couldn't afford to let my mind wander. Yet the whisper grew louder and more insistent. It felt cold and almost angry. My skin prickled with unease as I tried to focus on driving, but it was like trying to ignore an itch that wouldn't go away. About an hour later, things escalated. As I rounded a sharp curve, I caught movement in my rearview mirror, a flicker of something disappearing into the fog behind me. My heart raced as I nearly slammed on the brakes. At first, I thought it might be an animal or another vehicle, but when I looked again, there was nothing, just empty road swallowed by mist. Taking a deep breath to calm myself, I told myself that I was seeing things, that fatigue and fog were playing tricks on my eyes. But that explanation didn't sit right. The shadow had been too distinct, too human-like, and it wasn't just seeing something. It was the feeling accompanying it, a prickling sensation on my neck as if someone were watching me. By 4 a.m., I was a bundle of nerves. The whispering hadn't stopped. Shadows in my mirror became more frequent. Each time I looked back, I saw something for just a moment, a figure standing in the fog watching me. But when I blinked, it vanished. Was I losing my mind? Perhaps isolation and fatigue were pushing me to my limits. Then something happened that defied explanation. Driving down a long stretch of road with thick fog obscuring my vision, the whispering grew frantic, but remained indecipherable. Each glance in the rearview mirror left me half expecting another shadow, when suddenly I saw a face. I slammed on the brakes. My truck screeched to a halt in the middle of the road. My chest tightened as terror gripped me while staring at my reflection in the mirror. A pale face with dark, hollow eyes stared back at me. Frozen in place, I whipped around dreading to see someone behind me, but found only an empty back seat. For what felt like an eternity, my heart raced as I tried to process what I'd seen. There was no way someone could have entered without my noticing or vanished like that. Gripping the wheel tightly to steady myself, panic surged within me. as I forced myself to breathe. I didn't want to look in that mirror again. I dreaded seeing that face, but curiosity compelled me. Slowly lifting my gaze toward the rearview mirror revealed nothing but emptiness once more. However, its presence lingered in the cab with me, watching and waiting. I needed out. I needed to keep driving to distance myself from whatever haunted this road. Starting up again, with trembling hands on the wheel, I focused ahead and refused to glance back at what might be lurking behind. Suddenly, my radio crackled to life. At first, it seemed like static until closer listening revealed a voice buried within distorted and faint, as if trying to reach out from miles away. "Alex." I froze. This voice sounded low and guttural, as if rising from deep within the earth itself. Reaching out instinctively to turn off the radio only made it speak again. "Alex, don't look back." My heart raced as dread washed over me. Each repetition of its warning grew louder and more desperate. Don't look back. Despite knowing looking again might reveal something horrific, curiosity gnawed at me until finally I adjusted the mirror. Just enough for another glimpse into that back seat, where there it was again, the face staring coldly at me. Slamming down on the gas pedal, without thinking, straightened out my panic-fueled response. Speeding down that fog-covered road felt reckless yet necessary. The voice grew louder now, a cacophony screaming, "Don't look back." But fear held my gaze forward even as that chilling presence seemed closer. Now my hands shook uncontrollably against steering control, while darkness enveloped everything outside. The voice crackled, then fell silent for what felt like an eternity, until suddenly the fog lifted. I drove for hours until reaching a small town where I pulled into a diner parking lot, hands still trembling as silence enveloped me once more after cutting off my engine. Sitting there for what felt like ages, trying to steady myself, I couldn't shake off what had happened. Who would believe such madness? A ghostly face in my rearview. A voice warning not to look back. It sounded insane even to me. Yet deep down I knew what I'd seen, I knew what I'd heard. And even after all this time, I haven't dared drive through those mountains again. Because no matter how much time passes, I can't forget that face or how it stared at me. Sometimes late at night, when I'm alone on those roads, I still hear whispers urging, "Don't look back." And believe me, I never do. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to hit that like button and share your fear with friends. Subscribe for more terrifying tales from dark corners of our world. Stay safe out there, because sometimes what lurks in shadows is all too real. Thanks for watching, and drive carefully. See you in our next nightmare.